And let me start out by saying a little bit about the parameters of that question. What do I mean by fail us? So let me distinguish between failing and failing us. I'm not necessarily asserting that the G7 is going to outright fail. They may well come up with quite a good-looking memorandum at the end. There may well be some good things in it. I'm reasonably impressed, for example, that they're making a good stab at finally doing something which should have been done so long ago, namely taxing the digital behemoths, the Amazons, etc., of this world. If we do that, you know, maybe we might even have a chance of saving the Amazon. So they're not necessarily going to fail completely. My thought, though, is that it probably is inevitable that the G7 fails us. And what do I mean by that? I mean, fails us earthlings, fails the citizens, fails the future, fails the future ones. Because for them not to fail us, the bar is now set pretty high. It's set as high as not crashing our civilization and not producing mass death. Now you might think, well, that doesn't sound like a very high bar to set. But my thought is, well, in reality, it is pretty high, because not crashing our civilization and not producing mass death now requires very rapid and very systematic system change. So my answer to the question I've posed is yes, it is pretty much inevitable that the G7 fails us, so long as they try to keep the wheels on our current civilizational model, so long as they don't accept the need for profound, rapid change of the very basis of our civilization. For, as in the little book I put out a couple of years ago with the cheery title, "This Civilization is Finished," this civilization is finished. What I mean by that is not that we're bound to collapse and have multiple megadeaths, but that the only way we now get to avoid that is by transforming our civilization so rapidly and radically that in no meaningful sense will it continue to be the same civilization. So as Matt said in his opening remarks, our crisis is not just an ecological and climate crisis. It is a crisis of political economy. It is a crisis of democracy. It is a spiritual crisis, I would claim. It is a crisis of paradigm. Only full spectrum system change can save us now if the criterion for saving us now is preventing a disorderly collapse. Our civilization has grown beyond planetary limits. There is no chance that this civilization, as it is, can be sustained. And my thinking here is influenced, among others, by William Ophuls. He has a passing remark in one of his wonderful books, which I've tried to elaborate into something a bit more systematic. He says in one of his books, we might think about the way that civilizations succeed each other, because of course they do when you look at things in the long run, on a model with the way that ecological moments or ecological levels of organization succeed each other. So in ecology, as most of you will, I'm sure, know, you have a sort of rapid pioneering stage, and that tends to lead to a stage of a kind of dynamic equilibrium. And then usually, perhaps always, eventually something interferes pretty drastically with that, and there's some kind of collapse, and then the cycle starts again. We need to think about how we can achieve civilizational succession, and how, just possibly, we may still be able to avoid the collapse stage. Now, probably we can't avoid it, or at least probably we won't avoid it, and that's the purport, as many of you will probably be aware, of the concept of deep adaptation, which was put together by my colleague Jem Bendell a few years ago now. And this book, which is just out, is the first book on the topic. I chose to edit that book with Jem, not because he and I agree about everything, we don't, but because I thought that the concept of deep adaptation is a concept of fundamental importance that needs to be much more than a concept. And the reason it's of fundamental importance is simply stated. It's because probably we won't stop some kind of collapse event or events this century. And what deep adaptation means is adaptation to an actual societal collapse. But as Matt hinted in his opening remarks, I've also for some years now been developing the concept of transformative adaptation. And the idea of transformative adaptation is we still aim at avoiding that collapse while being realistic about our slim chances of succeeding in that aim. So that's an important difference. There's lots of overlaps between transformative and deep adaptation. We'll talk about those in questions if you want. But there's an important difference between deep adaptation and transformative adaptation. Transformative adaptation aims at preventing collapse and at morphing the entire nature of our society, if possible, without enduring some kind of collapse event. What is transformative adaptation, more positively? Let me spend some time talking about that. So disasters are coming. Climate disasters, ecological disasters are coming. Well, in fact, they're already here. Look at the Australian fires. Look at the Arctic fires. Not really a phrase I ever thought I'd have to say very often. Arctic fires is something going pretty badly wrong as soon as you get to that point. For the last several years, it's become obvious, since about 2016, how our weather is weirding. It's too late for prevention or so-called mitigation to succeed without the need for adaptation. Let me take a moment to discuss this term mitigation. This is the technical term used in relation to climate to describe the reduction of carbon emissions, which is obviously what everybody's been supposedly aiming at for some time now. It's a bit of an odd term, though, this term mitigation. What you're really trying to do, or what people were really trying to do, was prevent dangerous climate change. Yeah, but now it's too late to prevent dangerous climate change. Dangerous climate change is here. Climate disasters are here. And these things are inevitably going to get worse for some time to come, primarily because of the vicious feedbacks which have now started to be released, also because of an inertia in the system. So what this implies is that there is now no way of avoiding the need for adaptation. So key now is for that adaptation to be the right kind of adaptation. And it's increasingly pressing that we narrate this topic and that we define adaptation. Because what adaptation has tended to mean up until quite recently is what's technically called incremental adaptation, what's sometimes criticized as shallow adaptation. I think a useful term for it is defensive adaptation. What adaptation has meant up until now is primarily things like higher seawalls and more robust flood defenses on rivers, to give an example. Shallow, incremental, defensive adaptation isn't. It isn't actually adaptation. It's simply an attempt, which is bound to fail, to perpetuate the current civilizational paradigm. We need to have a way of understanding what adaptation is or could be, which is not merely attempting to keep that same failed, flawed show on the road. Ergo, the need for deep adaptation, but also the need for something which is a little bit less full-on than deep adaptation, namely transformative adaptation. And here I would like to acknowledge the great importance for my own work and that of others of my colleagues in the Greenhouse think tank, who put together this book a few years ago, Facing Up to Climate Reality, Honesty, Disaster and Hope, edited by John Foster, which seeks to develop this idea of transformative adaptation systematically, really for the first time. And I also want to acknowledge my colleagues in the Transformative Adaptation Collective, which is a sort of growing team which was spawned really out of Extinction Rebellion, of people who are trying to think together and start to work together towards making transformative adaptation a reality on the ground in this country. And we can talk about that more later if you wish. As I've already mentioned, It's obvious that deep adaptation and transformative adaptation will overlap to a large extent. It's obvious, for example, that systematic efforts at building resilience will be key to both. There remains, however, an important difference in emphasis, which is, as I said a few minutes ago, encapsulated in the thought that transformative adaptation aims at avoiding collapse. Let me say a little bit more to fill out the idea of transformative adaptation further. Transformative adaptation has at its heart future-proofed relocalization. We have to make sure that what we do does not end up being maladaptation, does not end up being, for example, designed for a level of overheat that is less than we are predictably going to encounter. Transformative adaptation involves working with nature realistically. So in terms of the example of flood defenses, it would involve things like restoring mangrove swamps in other countries, in countries like this one, restoring wetlands, doing things which can potentially, if you do them right, sequester carbon, work with nature rather than against nature, and potentially be compatible with flourishing, relocalized societies and communities. Now, the G7 is going to be focusing, insofar as it focuses on climate, on mitigation, so-called mitigation. As a little aside here, let me actually pose the question: why is it the case that among international leaders and activists alike, there has been to date so little focus on adaptation? So I have a view as to why this is. Once you focus on adaptation, it makes the crisis real to you. It involves recognizing that the crisis is real. And that's actually something that virtually all of us, virtually all of the time, don't want to do. We who recognize the reality of the crisis, at least just about some of the time, we have tended not to want to give up on dreams of full justice and full flourishing and prevention of dangerous climate change and prevention of ecological breakdown. But for the reasons I indicated 5 or 10 minutes ago, that is unfortunately no longer a credible position. We need to mature now. We need to recognize the reality of the situation that we're in, a situation of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damages. We need to recognize that there is now no way through this civilizational crisis without considerable pain. Defensive adaptation is a form of giving up. It's a form of giving up because it's basically saying we're not going to be able to hold back these rising tides, and we're not really going to try. An interesting example is the position of Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, that he took last year. After many years of denying climate change, Scott Morrison segued straight into saying, well, we're just going to have to adapt. And what he means by that is defensive adaptation. He means keeping the wheels on his failed, flawed, civilizational, neoliberal, etc. Model and trying to keep that show on the road a while longer. In this sense, defensive adaptation is a form of giving up on trying to make things better. Deep adaptation alone can be perceived as giving up because it doesn't appear to hold out any positive hope for preventing collapse. Although I do want to insist, and this is something that's brought out very clearly in our book, that that is not part of the definition of deep adaptation in the sense that Jem has said, for example, deep adaptation is for people who think that collapse is already unfolding, is inevitable, which is what he believes, or is likely, which is what I believe. But of course, if you only think it's likely, you still keep that room open, and that open space is what transformative adaptation emphasizes. So the key thing about transformative adaptation in this context then is it is a way of framing adaptation which is in that sense affirmative and could, I think, rally people to it who are going to be put off by a deep adaptation vision alone and who are going to see through the way in which defensive adaptation is a hopeless project and is clearly a form of giving up on trying to prevent things from getting worse. So I think we've been unwilling to focus on adaptation, because when we focus on adaptation, when we talk about adaptation, when we do adaptation, it's a form of acknowledging and living the reality of the crisis. And leaders haven't wanted to do that for fairly obvious reasons, and activists haven't wanted to do that because they worried that it would be perceived as giving up. It's past time for it's past time for being held ransom by that worry now. We have to enter into the space of adaptation, and I'm suggesting the way to do so includes deep adaptation and should focally include transformative adaptation. It is especially peculiar that there has been so little focus on adaptation when you note the point that actually most so-called mitigation action has benefits, direct benefits, that are only long-term and for the globe at large. Whereas adaptation typically has benefits that are short-term and for the people who engage in the adaptational behaviors. So you do need some kind of quite strong reason to not engage in adaptation, to not get serious about it. The suggestion I've made is that that reason is that when you do get serious about it and engage in it, well, then you really are being serious for the first time, and that's what we've not wanted to do. So, the G7 this week will be focusing on mitigation. They will focus on it within the context of continued industrial growth society. This is quite obviously not system change, this is not paradigm change, this is not potential civilizational succession, and this is not the kind of vision that will enable us to get serious about adaptation, especially if we're thinking of it in the form of transformative adaptation. The G7 are simply not going to contemplate the need for transformative adaptation. So it's down to we the people to be the leaders. The situation that we're in is a grim one. Our leaders are simply not going to lead. We can help nudge them into being less bad, more like Biden, less like Johnson. The idea that they, even the best of them, are going to really wake up to the reality that I've indicated in my talk so far today is risible. The G7 are going to fail us. To be in denial about that fact will fuel burnout. If you go into protests at the G7 or at any other similar event with the thought, we can here and now persuade them to do a 360-degree, or actually 180 is better, isn't it, reversal of direction and simply adopt the things that we're calling for, that kind of naivety is what leads to burnout, because it is bound to lead to disappointment. We need to be realistic about the situation that we are in, and the situation that we are in is a difficult and grim one. That leads into my conclusions, which I want to present to you now, and which hopefully will frame the Q&A and discussion that we are about to have. First conclusion, we need to talk about adaptation. Secondly, we need to push for it, and we need to start to undertake it. What that is based on thinking is that they are not going to lead on it, and they are not going to start doing much undertaking of it. That implies that adaptation, transformative adaptation, is going to have to be, to a considerable extent, a bottom-up activity. That is very demanding and difficult, but it can be done, and it has to be done. Because, third conclusion, we need to not let anything stand in our way as we pursue this agenda. Because our very survival, let alone flourishing, is at stake. And this suggests, and this is what the collective that I'm part of, the Transformative Adaptation Collective, this is what has suggested to us a new role for nonviolent direct action. The role of nonviolent direct action, as it's been envisaged hitherto in Extinction Rebellion, is a role for direct action which primarily involves mass consciousness raising and pressure on governments. Both splendid things. But part of the painful waking up process that I believe we have to continue to undergo together now is a realization that pressure on governments is not going to be enough. It's not going to succeed enough. If we think about it in terms of the Extinction Rebellion demands, it's a fact perhaps noted less often than it should be that we're now in 2021. The demands were formulated in 2018. The demands in countries like this one are for an end to biodiversity destruction and dangerous climate emissions by 2025. We're almost halfway through. We're 3 of 7 years have gone. How credible is that the entire supertanker can be turned around within the next 4 years? I mean, it's obvious that at some point that becomes completely non-credible. Is it that you wait until there's only 6 months left? It seems to me it'd be better to start to change a little bit sooner than that. So my suggestion is it really is high time that movements such as Extinction Rebellion, also organizations such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, political organizations such as the Green Party, it really is high time for these organizations to start to get serious about adaptation. And I've tried to suggest in this talk that what it means to get serious about adaptation is to purvey an agenda of transformative adaptation supported by deep adaptation. But as I say, this really is a matter of survival. This is not just about nice to haves. So we must not let anything stand in our way. The new role for nonviolent direct action that this suggests is that as well as mass consciousness raising and pressure on government, there could be and should be a more sort of positive form of nonviolent direct action, which is to support, where necessary, the projects of transformative adaptation starting to be undertaken from the ground up. And this suggests an interesting difference in emphasis between how one would figure the role of nonviolent direct action in relation to transformative adaptation compared to how one would figure it according to the classic Extinction Rebellion theory of change. In the classic Extinction Rebellion theory of change, which I confess I was always a little bit skeptical of from the beginning, and that's a matter of public record. You can look at my debates with Roger Hallam and so on and so forth. In the classic XR theory of change, the idea was that the primary driver of change would be pressure on government, forcing government to negotiation table, supported obviously by moving the Overton window, by moving the public conversation. Extinction Rebellion succeeded brilliantly in shifting the public conversation basically in April 2019, and that has had a quasi-permanent effect, especially in this country. But while there were effects on power, while there was a climate and nature emergency voted through, symbolic motion voted through by Parliament, while we got a net zero target enshrined in law for the first time, although of course far too late, and while Parliament put together a citizens' assembly, albeit one without enough powers, etc. So power conceded something to each of Extinction Rebellion's 3 demands, but only something to each of those demands. According to the classic Extinction Rebellion theory of change, the idea of the theory was supposed to be that you engage in mass nonviolent direct action, fill the jail cells, etc., and you're seeking arrest for the sake of it in order to pressurize government and produce public opinion change. The difference with transformative adaptation would be that rather than seeking arrest deliberately, you would be only resorting to nonviolent direct action when it was actually necessary to start to achieve or support positive goals leading towards ground-up transformative adaptation, which could then be potentially learnt from, scaled up, etc., by governing institutions. So the vibe, if you will, would be one which is kind of more positive and less instrumentalizing of nonviolent direct action, rather than deliberately seeking, as I say, to get arrested. You're thinking, what about if we only use this as a technique when it's actually necessary in order to achieve and support strategic aims? Okay, that's what I wanted to say. I want to leave you with one practical starting point relevant to where we are right now, namely the day before the G7 starts. And the starting point is this. It seems to me that an implication of what I've been saying this afternoon, if it's right, is that a key moment in the process of any meeting such as the G7 is the moment at which it ends. Because that moment is the moment at which it is absolutely clear that the organisation in question is failing us. That is the moment where the millions or billions watching can be potentially persuaded of that. Up until that point, everyone's thinking things along the lines of, oh, well, how can we make this better? How can we put pressure on to add to a better outcome, a better communique, etc. At the end? My argument has been it's a fool's errand to think that activity, the activity of protests, etc., in the next few days, is even conceivably going to lead to the outcome that we need. So the most important moment is the moment at the end. The most important moment is to use that as a basis for segueing to saying, we're not defeated, we're not just going to go away with our tails between our legs, we're not burning out. Rather, we're seeing this as a moment to start to pivot towards a new agenda. We're seeing this as a moment to start to pivot towards the kind of future that we actually need in the terrible situation that we're in. In other words, we're seeing this as a moment to start to pivot towards transformative adaptation and the like. And if we were to do that, then, as is implicit in my talk, that would be a way to make the crisis real to a much larger number of people. Right? So rather than, for example, people on their TV screens and so on and so forth, and in the newspapers that will come out next Monday, simply seeing a lot of protesters and then the protesters going away disappointed, what they would be seeing is a lot of protesters saying, you know what, it's pointless to expect anymore that these are the people who are going to sort this out for us. They are not. They are going to fail us. They have failed us right now. We need to be realistic about the situation that we're in, and that implies that we need to start to prepare for a potential civilizational collapse, and we need to aim to start to achieve ourselves as much as we can of the system change that we need, because they're not going to do it for us. And that's quite attractive, it seems to me, because that involves a kind of taking back of the power, which is kind of given away to democratic leaders in elective dictatorships such as our own. So this is the kind of suggestion I want to make with regard to how we think about the G7 and how we act towards the G7 is the most important moment is not what happens tonight as we think about the next few days to come. It's not what happens tomorrow when we initiate protests. It's what happens on Sunday and what happens on Monday as we narrate and as we pivot and as we start to make it real to the people of the world, the grimness of the situation that we're in. If activists start to say, you know what, we're just not going to get all that we want and all that we should have had, and start to grieve that in a deeper way than I think we have done so far, even in organizations like Extinction Rebellion, and start to pivot towards adaptation and not just mitigation, that in itself tells an incredibly powerful story. The watching millions or billions, some of them at least will start to think, if those people who are so passionate about achieving change are giving up on the forlorn hope that the change that we need is going to come through the existing structures of power, and giving up on the forlorn hope that the change that we had hoped to have, a shift to a society that would be fully just and that would prevent dangerous climate change and so forth. If those people are making that pivot, then maybe the crisis really is real, and maybe we have to get serious about what happens next. And that, as I have said throughout, that is the great advantage of the adaptation narrative, provided you get it right, compared to the mitigation-only narrative. It makes it real to us and to those who are watching. So that's my practical suggestion for how we orient ourselves towards the next few days of protests here at the G7 in Cornwall and perhaps around the world. And one very final remark. If I'm right in that kind of strategic thinking and sort of movement change thinking, this becomes even more important when we look forward towards the COP. the climate COP taking place again in this country, in Glasgow of this year, in many ways arguably a much more significant event even than this G7. The G7 is a sort of a dry run or dress rehearsal in a number of ways for that climate COP. So my suggestion then would translate into the following. If we're thinking about how to organise towards the climate COP, the key thing is not to think, right, how do we maximise pressure in the run-up to it? The key thing is not to think, how do we get a huge march together for the weekend in the middle of the COP, which is traditionally when you get the largest numbers of protesters at the COP. The key thing is to think about how do we prepare for Sunday the 12th of November, Friday the 12th of November, and Saturday the 13th of November, and Monday the 15th of November. Those are actually the key dates, the end of the COP, because just as I want to say that it is inevitable that the G7 fails us as long as it doesn't recognise that this civilization is finished and that we need to embrace an agenda of transformative adaptation, so it is inevitable that the climate COP will fail us for the same systemic and tragic reason. And the opportunity that presents potentially, if we make the kind of shift that I've outlined here this afternoon, the opportunity that presents potentially is an opportunity to achieve the mother of all pivots in what the climate movement and broader movements do and are, and in how, therefore, they narrate to the world the situation that tragically, but also with opportunities within that tragedy, the world and its citizens are now in. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing these matters with you.
Thanks. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of transformative direct action that you're suggesting as an alternative to the kind of classic exile strategy of putting pressure on governments and shifting the Overton window. What in concrete terms do you actually mean by that
Yeah.
kind of action?
Yeah. There are many possible forms in which that could take, but a couple that I've written about a little and that are touched on the transformative adaptation website that is now taking shape would be as follows. If we think about the food system, which is obviously absolutely critical, and which obviously has been the focus of the work of the Transition Towns movement. If you think about the food system, what about the idea of creating cleverly cited pop-up allotments, which you then actually try to defend, right? So a bit like what Extinction Rebellion did in the action on Trinity College lawn, except instead of just desecrating the lawn, which went down really badly, what you do is you say, look, actually, we are looking, especially in a country like the UK, we're looking down the barrel of a potential future food crises as the climate crisis continues to escalate. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this space, that's just an example, use this space to grow food in, and if the police try to stop us from doing so, we're actually going to try to be serious about defending it. An easier locale for that than the Trinity College lawn might be something like a kind of basic lawn in front of a council building, or it could be some piece of National Trust land, or it could be some piece of corporate land from some corporation that's made some claims to be eco-friendly and so on. You see what I'm getting at there? You can start to think quite creatively, and you start to think about, okay, where could we try to set up in a way and in a place that it would be symbolic but also real? Because, you know, the idea would be we're actually going to try to defend this, and we're actually going to try to grow food here. So it would be like what the Transition Towns movement did at Grow Heath Row. You know, there are real examples of this having been done before, but I'm thinking, what if we did this strategically and tactically, kind of all over the place? Another somewhat similar example would be mass guerrilla gardening that you're serious about again. So there are parks now where some quite good sort of bits of rewilding are going on. So what about kind of moving into some of those bits and doing some sort of agri-wilding, right? Which is like agriculturally minded rewilding, yeah? Or what about moving to some of the other bits of the park where that hasn't been happening so much, and trying to do planting there at scale, which again, if they try to revert to what it's supposed to be instead, you might try to defend. So far, guerrilla gardening has been a sort of cheeky chappy kind of thing and a cute little symbolic thing. But what if it was something where you were actually sort of trying to, like, think of it sort of landscape scale guerrilla gardening? Wouldn't that be a really exciting idea? We could talk about more possibilities, but perhaps that gives you the idea of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Yeah.
That mobilises them, so I guess that's what I was talking about.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and obviously an important question. Let me repeat it. The question is, this kind of pivot that I'm talking about, how do we do it in a way that doesn't mobilise despair, but actually mobilises? But look, I think the situation is quite complex. I used to be very worried about fomenting despair. When I started, so let me go back a few years. So in 2016, I was, as it happens, delivering some leaflets for the Green Party one day, and these words just flashed into my head: "This civilization is finished." I was like, "Whoa, where did that come from? What's going on here?" And it was kind of shocking. And I reflected on it in the next few days, and it wouldn't go away. And I started to do what I do, which is to write about it. And I wrote this piece, and I shared it with just a few close friends and colleagues at first. And I said, please don't forward this on or whatever, because I'm really worried that this is going to seriously demotivate people. I'm also kind of worried that I might get attacked for it and accused of giving up and so forth. But people responded by saying, "Look, Rupert, actually, this is more important than stuff you've written before. This is really good. This is stuff that needs to be said. This is something kind of new." Eventually, after about a year, I allowed a colleague to publish it anonymously, because I was still really worried about being attacked. Again, the response was very positive. I then gave a talk to a bunch of my students, a public talk, along the same lines, in which I said that I didn't envy them, because I thought it was quite likely that their future would involve civilizational collapse sooner than for me, as it were, because I'm a lot older. And again, I was quite nervous, but again, what actually happened was that students came up to me afterwards and said things like, "Gosh, this really feels like the first time that any adult in a position of responsibility has really leveled with us." Why am I telling you this story? Well, one reason I'm telling you this story is because what this experience indicated to me, that the more I went on kind of developing this idea, and eventually it became the book, "This Civilization is Finished," and so forth, obviously, and my viral Cambridge University talk with the same title. Lots of people are kind of half despairing already, right? And that, of course, is one of the things that Extinction Rebellion has sort of built on, really, is tapping into that well of profound eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, and of the way in which it's been debilitating for people insofar as they typically haven't shared it and have felt isolated in it. And Extinction Rebellion has been a way, and also for younger people, the climate school strikes in some cases, a way of kind of coming together around that. There have been other ways as well, of course, but one of the most positive ways of coming together in the face of that kind of anxiety is obviously really doing something about it in that kind of way. So the first point in response to your question, and I would say it's a crucial one, is yeah, of course it's possible that what I say might foment despair, but what I tend to find is that what I say kind of allows people to express their already existing despair or anxiety or grief or whatever it is. Now, obviously also what I'm hoping to do is frame this in a way which proposes and manifests a viable, realistic, actionable set of ways of dealing with that potential despair. So my suggestion, implicit in the talk, was a suggestion that if you've got a kind of mitigation-only focused activism, there's liable to be either a kind of mismatch with what people are actually thinking is the reality of our situation, or a kind of massive disappointment when it gets to the point of people gradually realizing we're not going to win with this alone. It's too late, or it's too huge, etc. to do that. So my proposal, we need to fold in adaptation with mitigation. We need to do that in a way which at least aims at, and again, here hoping to be psychologically positive and not too overwhelming, which at least aims at the possibility that we can get through this without multiple mega deaths, without some form of civilizational collapse event. And in that way, of course, distinguished from a deep adaptation only approach, which runs the risk, I would say, of being, for some people, demotivating, because it seems to involve a giving up on the prospect of avoiding collapse events. So I hope that I've got the whole thing kind of reasonably well judged in the way that I'm calibrating it here. And this is the basis on which I've been working with colleagues in Greenhouse and colleagues in the Transformative Adaptation Collective, that you achieve a sort of balance between, on the one hand, a sort of slightly Pollyanna-ish mitigation-only emphasis, and on the other hand, deep adaptation or other forms of approaches which appear to be forms of doomerism. And that's why I want to say we need all of these. Yeah, we do need deep adaptation as a sort of ultimate insurance policy, most definitely. And what Extinction Rebellion has been doing is great, and it should carry on. And I hope that others do something similar. I'm trying to get that happening, for example, through the Green Party with the Greens Climate Activists Network. But also, I would hope that Extinction Rebellion might finally get to the point this year or so, and really it should be this year because of the pivotal importance of this year, and we could talk more about that if you want, that Extinction Rebellion should get to the point of taking adaptation really seriously. Adaptation is sort of mentioned in Extinction Rebellion's demands and here and there, but it's really way, way down the list. And myself and some other colleagues in XR were concerned about this from a relatively early stage, and the more time that goes by, the greater the concern becomes. And I would hope that some people in deep adaptation might consider the case for including a sort of transformative adaptation aspect of what they're doing, and maybe also people in the transition towns movement. We need kind of alliance thinking and mutual self-help, if you will, and part of what would be the ideal scenario, as far as I'm concerned, would be to have a sort of alliance between deep adaptation, transition towns, permaculture, Extinction Rebellion, relevant people in the Green Party, etc., all realizing that there is a potential kind of golden mean or sort of soft spot in the middle, as it were, here, which I try to focus around this concept of transformative adaptation. What do you think? Do you think it's going to do the job in terms of addressing the eco-anxiety you're concerned about?
I think so. I think it's as someone who perhaps is an optimist and probably is guilty of looking at the mitigation and prevention all the time. Actually, the acceptance that the world is going to be very different for us from here forward. Like there is the adaptation. I think I really resonate with that, and I think you're right. If you can tie groups together. And I think localized, small scale, like regional or even parish level adaptations can be really important.
Yeah. I think that's really right. And I guess another aspect of this would be this: that one of the let's put it this way, that the chances of getting the change that we need through anything like the existing power structures, as I said in my talk, are so minuscule that they're almost not worth considering. They're a lot more minuscule, it seems to me, than the chances of, by one way or another, managing to avoid civilizational collapse. It might be that we manage to create a whole new power in the land, a whole new powerful movement. It might be a sort of revived, expanded Extinction Rebellion, or in my opinion, it's much more likely to be something new and with a wider appeal to take off. We might be able to get that to take off if we can really bring home to people in the next year the reality of the crisis. Because what was implicit in my talk is that still hasn't really been done. Yes, you've got people saying now, in answer to opinion pollsters, it's a climate emergency. That's great, you know, that's a kind of progress. A lot of that was achieved by XR and by Greta. But there's a real danger that that's only skin deep, yeah? So people will say that, and at the same time they'll say they back, you know, in new enhanced powers for the police to whack protesters. And they'll say that they think that the post-COVID reset should be green, and they'll also say that they want a resumption of foreign holidays and so forth. Now, how do we achieve a greater kind of cut-through to really enable that kind of awakening at depth and at scale that we need? The claim that I'm making, and it's somewhat similar to the claim of the brilliant French collapsologist whose work I much recommend if you haven't encountered it. The claim that I'm making is that we are likely to get that if we get, and I haven't spoken about this really in my talk today, but you can find this in other stuff that's going on at the moment and in other stuff that I've written. If we get more scientists coming clean about the gravity of the situation, and that's starting to happen. For example, the article by my colleague Wolfgang Knorr and others recently in The Conversation, which some of you may have seen, and in The Independent, saying that net zero is a dangerous, empty fantasy that kicks real action down the road. That's one of the things that needs to happen. But it's not the only thing. Another thing that needs to happen, it seems to me, is that a much wider cohort than scientists need to make manifest to the population at large the reality of the crisis. And the cohort I'm thinking of is all relevant academics, not just scientists, and activists. Yeah, activists, climate campaigners, people in political parties, etc. If those people, the people who are well known as the people who really pay attention to this, who really care about it, who many people in the general population think, well, maybe I can sort of outsource the worry to them. You know, these kind of worries, your average person on the street spends quite a lot of time finding, not that much time, spends some time finding ways in which they can outsource their worries, which in many cases they have on these matters, to either scientists or politicians or activists and campaigners, right? We can make it more difficult for that outsourcing to occur if we get them to understand that we need them, that a much larger movement is needed, that a much deeper transformation is needed. And if we get them to understand that this really is 1000% real, how do we do that? We do that by not pretending any longer that we're going to mitigate our way out of this. We do it by not pretending any longer that the crisis can be prevented. Instead, it is here. Disasters are here. How do we do that? By getting serious about adaptation.
Academics, scientists, artists have not been able to.
Okay, so the question, as I heard that, was who are the people who are in the best position to influence the general public in the right direction in relation to what we've been talking about here today? And the suggestion was maybe it's celebrities, sports people, etc. Look, I think those people are not unimportant and not devoid of potential, absolutely. You do need to be quite careful with them. Extinction Rebellion have come a cropper with this a few times, for example, with sort of flying Emma Thompson in to speak at an XR rally. Celebrities and sports people are in a difficult position when it comes to being thought leaders on matters environmental, because they tend to have very high personal footprints. And if they're going to get serious about changing that, Great. If they're not, it's difficult for them to take up a leadership stance. That, of course, is the reason why Greta has done the things she's done, involving considerable personal self-sacrifice, taking boats around the world and so forth. I myself decided a couple of years ago to finally stop flying, not because I believe that personal behaviour change is a key to achieving the transformations that we need. It's only really a drop in the ocean, but because of it having some symbolic importance, and because I just didn't want to kind of leave the door open to whatever right-wing tabloids and so on to slag me off for flying around. They've got plenty enough to slag me off for already without gifting them that for free. Look, I think you shouldn't underestimate the power of scientists, artists, activists, who were some of the groups you mentioned. Scientists have a lot of power here because, for good or for ill, they are perceived as being the ones who sort of own the climate and ecological emergency, in terms of being the ones who really know it and understand it. And there are some complexities there that we could discuss. For example, I'm on record as offering some criticisms of Michael Mann for overextending his claims to expertise beyond climate science, to claim to be able to tell us what kind of rhetoric and what kind of political rhetoric and so forth is effective, which is, way beyond his subject speciality. And he would argue, if he were here this afternoon, he would argue that I'm sounding far too doomy, being far too pessimistic, this is disastrous, etc. I think he's completely wrong, and I think he's welcome to his opinion, but he shouldn't claim that because he's a climate scientist, he can dictate, as it were, to the rest of us what kind of rhetoric we should use. But scientists have, climate scientists, ecologists, etc., have a lot of potential power and influence because they are perceived as having ownership of the issue, and because it often gets outsourced to them. Artists, it does depend slightly what you mean by artists. But for example, I was very impressed by the success of the film Avatar some years ago. And you might say, that's just entertainment, right? But I think that's too dismissive. I think that Avatar was a really impressive work in many ways. Of course, it's got things one could criticize in it, but a really impressive work that resonated so deeply with many people, precisely because in a really quite mythic and intelligent way, it evoked and manifested ecological concerns really, really strongly. There's plenty of evidence to support the thought that is why it was so successful, in terms of what people have said about why they loved it so much, etc. So I would say that art has not achieved anything like its potential yet, in terms of literature, drama, certainly TV, at reaching people effectively, at communicating with them effectively. If you talk to scientists about this, they'll often say, well, I'm just a kind of boring scientist. I really need exciting kind of expert communicators like artists to give strength to my message. I think that there's truth in that. And then finally, to come back briefly to activists, because I've already said a lot about activists. I think that activists sometimes feel quite sort of beleaguered and are often attacked by the mainstream press and so on and so forth. But again, activists are a group that ordinary real people do a lot of outsourcing to. They think something like, well, those people are taking care of that. I'll leave it to them to get out on the street. I'm too busy for that, etc. We've got to overcome that attitude, right? And part of the way we overcome that attitude, it seems to me, is if activists start to say, you know what, we've kind of lost. The struggle we were engaged in, we've lost. That's quite a strong way of putting the message that I'm giving here. Paradoxically, the real power to mobilize a profound societal transformation, including possibly much greater results indirectly at the COP or at general elections or whatever than we've had before. Paradoxically, the route to that may well be for the likes of scientists and activists to come clean this year and say, you know what, we've lost. The dream we had, that's over. And we now have to take seriously methods of adaptation, etc. And without making that sound just like giving up, right? I think that could be an incredibly powerful moment. The collapsologists say the only conceivable way we get to achieve a more general consciousness of the possibility of not having an uncontrolled collapse is by really facing the impending reality of collapse. It sounds very paradoxical, but when you really think it through, I think there's something deeply true about it. Unless you actually think, my God, we're heading straight for this. We have to engage in deep adaptation. We have to engage in transformative adaptation. Unless you manage to do something like that, you do not have a chance, it seems to me, of mobilizing the seriousness and the mass involvement that we need.
Thank you, Rupert. I've got a couple of questions online, but if we've got time for are we doing all right?
Yeah.
Because online question is, I just want to come back because I feel that there's a thread there that I'd like to not drop and move past. I'd like to just gently push back against the idea that the arts have not yet begun to really find their traction with this. Or I don't remember how you put it. I think Avatar is a really good example.
Yeah, it's happened in film to some extent.
One of the brilliant things about Avatar was never acknowledged by James Cameron and the Hollywood producers who made that film, which is that it's based on a great novel by Ursula Le Guin. The word for world is forest, and I defy anyone to read the word for world is forest and not see that here is the core coding of everything that really grabs the heart in Avatar. And at the same time, Avatar, the worst side of Avatar is it takes the deep ambiguity and the deep meditation on the mindset of empire in Ursula Le Guin's book, and it reduces it to a narcissistic hero narrative, kind of comparable to Dances with Wolves. It's all about the kind of hero turning against his own tribe, having the moral courage to sort of side with the oppressed. I think there's something that's been at work in the arts. For me, I keep going back to the 1970s to people like Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler.
Yeah.
Who I think were I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to call them prophetic.
Yeah.
Voice in the arts, people like that. There are these people who are at work in the body of culture. 10 years ago, we had a talk here from when we first met Paul Kingsnorth and the Dark Mountain Project came down. One of the things the Dark Mountain Project did so usefully, I think, 10 years ago, was actually reclaim a space for the arts from what the Green Movement naturally want to do with it.
Yeah.
The Green Movement does tend to frame this as we've got to do that or that'll happen, help us artists, help us convince them.
Yeah.
And there's a lovely phrase, sorry this is a long question.
No, it's good.
There's a lovely phrase by the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson, who was a student and friend of Ursula Le Guin. There's a great interview with him on Vicky Robbins' Post-Carbon Future website. And in relation to his new book, The Ministry for the Future,
Yeah.
he uses this phrase, which you may know, it was new to me, but I think it applies so well to what arts are at work doing now, which is fostering a new structure of thought and feeling. And I feel that, to me, there's a great development in the chaplaincy here at Falmouth as well. We've got a pagan chaplain who's also now town councillor, Zoe Young, and there's a lovely intersection of different levels of our community. But I think this engagement with how do we begin to articulate a new structure of thought and feeling?
Yeah.
Instead of saying we've got 12 years to save the world, we start preparing for how we're going to talk to the 18-year-olds
Yeah.
in 12 years' time.
Yeah. Good.
This is the world that's coming to them.
Yeah.
So,
Matt, look, I couldn't agree more. I think what you've said is super. I hope it's implicit in the positive stuff I've been saying, for example, about deep adaptation and about collapsology and collapsosophy, which is the sort of philosophical version of what the collapsologists are doing. I haven't mentioned Dark Mountain explicitly, but I completely agree. I think incredible quality work coming out there, which is genuinely important. I think Paul Kingsnorth's first novel, The Wake, is a really profound, useful meditation on civilizational collapse. I'm a deep admirer of that. Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin, absolutely, deeply important. Of course, both now dead. I'd like to see a bit more stuff happening right now of a similar kind of quality or moment. You mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. Super novel, problematic, I think, though. Clearly, in my opinion, over-optimistic. Not taking the need for adaptation seriously enough. And also, intriguingly, not taking the need for non-violent direct action seriously enough, I think. In terms of the word for world is forest, totally agreed. Almost certainly, in my opinion, Le Guin's greatest novel, a huge influence on Avatar, although there are also many other influences on Avatar that we could mention if we wanted to go into that. I think that Avatar is superior to Dances with Wolves or Little Big Man in that I don't think your characterization of it as having a kind of a narcissistic hero narrative is quite fair. Firstly, I think the point about Avatar is that it is self-consciously envisaged as being targeted primarily towards an audience of Americans, Europeans, etc., to try to take them vicariously on that journey. So it was deliberate. Secondly, unlike in those other predecessor films, the hero's journey in Avatar really is an incredibly painful one. I mean, the whole destruction of Home Tree and so forth. I mean, basically, you know, he fails, and he fails in his transformation and betrays the people he allegedly means to be helping. And then at the end of the film, again, of course, the crucial thing about the end of the film, as I read it, is that the military uprising also fails, and you only get a happy ending by way of Gaia, as it were, herself waking up and sending the animals in to fight on the righteous side. So if one's thinking about this as analogous to our own situation, well, you know, there isn't much chance of that happening. So again, it seems to me that Avatar, in that sense, invites you to think deeply about how bad our situation is and about how we're going to need to deal extremely wisely with it. But Matt, look, I think we're fundamentally in agreement. I didn't mean to sound negative about the arts. What I do think is that in some of the arts, and especially in the absolutely vital medium for our time of television, there has been a woeful inadequacy overall on balance to date, and there's a huge kind of space there waiting to be occupied. And really what I was trying to say was, you know, I hope that artists and writers of all types are really actively thinking about how to fill that space, because it's of incredibly great importance. I want to just mention one more brilliant positive example, which is Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, which is a novel about trees and about nonviolent direct action and about nonviolence and violence, and so it is absolutely amazing. And you know, more of those, please, would be my plea to the artists in the room.
I think the Overstory is a transformational book.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. That was a great answer. We've got a couple of questions from a friend, Julia Schofield, asks for a clarification about the difference between transformative adaptation and the preppers.
Yes, okay, that's a good question. I'm all in favour of a little bit of prepping. I think it's intelligent, and I think the good thing that you do when you do a bit of prepping, when you try to put some food and candles and so on in the attic, as I have, is you realise that it's pretty. It's going to buy you, you know, a few hours or days at most. not much more than that. And what we need is something that is much more, as it were, on landscape level or at scale. So I think that the simplest kind of starting point would be transformative adaptation is a bit like prepping, except you have to envisage it at minimum at sort of community scale. And ideally, you'd be thinking of it at societal scale and global scale. But this is why I made the point that, unfortunately, it seems utopian to expect that anything like the G7 is going to plump for many years to come for a sort of transformative adaptation-focused approach. So we're going to have to get on with it ourselves. And the suggestion is that we get on with it ambitiously but realistically, that we envisage it as something that goes a bit beyond what we've had to date from the transition towns and permaculture and so forth, precisely because we maybe learn some of the kind of techniques, etc., from Extinction Rebellion and Sunrise et al., and kind of think, okay, how can we sort of creatively marry the spirit of nonviolent direct action with the spirit of sort of community resilience, and create demonstration projects, start to create a kind of bottom-up groundswell. And that's sort of what I was seeking to indicate, some of the ways in which we might start to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rupert. I'm going to follow through another online question or two now, because they're stacking up. So from Gemma Ananathius Coleman, hope I pronounced that right, Gemma. Gemma's first question is, how do we get involved without protesting?
Okay. Well, obviously there are many ways to get involved without protesting. You can vote. You can be careful about how you spend your money and how you live your own individual life. However, as I mentioned briefly in the talk, I think that those ways, I think we need to be realistic that those ways alone are not going to be enough. So let's create a sort of a spectrum here. At one end, you've got those kinds of sort of personal actions. At the other end, maybe you've got mass nonviolent direct action. What's kind of in between? Well, so like one step back from mass nonviolent direct action might be strike action. That's sort of people protesting, as it were, via withdrawing their labour. One step forward from the purely sort of personal actions is stuff that you can do in your workplace, for example, and that's a crucial, for instance, because so much of us spend so much of our time in the workplace without striking. And I would say that that's a really important area for people to be focusing on now, who, for whatever reason, are not wanting to go down the protest route. So I think that in the situation that we're in now, people should really be trying to work hard through their trades unions, through their professional organizations, through the stakeholder engagement mechanisms that they might have, or by simply talking to their employers, or indeed, of course, their employees if they're an employer themselves. I think there's a huge swathe of things that people could potentially be doing in their workplaces to try to make up for the fact that governments are, by and large, on balance, failing us at this time. We need to have new activist organizations, if you will, in professions who are calling for zero emissions and zero biodiversity damage, who are looking to create resilience and guard against future crises and so on and so forth. And so perhaps that's my best answer to this question, that I think there's a huge amount that people can do through their workplaces which doesn't involve them having to protest. However, final point, having said that, I would say that I'm skeptical of the thought that even that on a very large scale would be enough. I think we need a lot more people doing that, but I think we need also a lot more people willing to protest and a lot more people willing to engage in strike action over the kind of things we're talking about here. And let me say one more word about that, because I do believe that's really, really important. If our children can go on strike, well then why can't we? You know, if they can be bothered to do something which risks their future, and we've got to remember, you know, children are pretty powerless beings, really. All right, they're stuck in these kind of regimented institutions, and that they don't have the autonomy, you know, mostly for good reasons, that adults do have, etc. It's astonishing what our children have accomplished in the last few years, but it seems to me a bit shaming if adults can't get to the point of doing at least as much as children. So I would say that in this absolutely pivotal moment, when we must kind of pivot towards really acknowledging the reality of the crisis and towards a viable form of adaptation in the kind of ways I laid out in my talk, I would say that at a moment like that, it really is imperative that there are adults in the room, as it were, who are willing to, at the least, engage in the kind of symbolic strike actions that children have been over the last few years. And one of the ways I think that should happen is by way of trying to get the post-COVID reset right. You know, if we get this wrong, we're so kind of, you know, fucked to the power of 3, right? This is our chance. That the way we build back from the pandemic is a God-given opportunity. You know, on the back of this horrible happenstance and carnage, a Gaia-given opportunity to create real change rapidly. If we don't transform what normal is in the next year or two, then we're missing the chance of this decade, which is the decade that we know is a kind of last chance saloon for any hope, really, of avoiding civilizational collapse. So I would say we need now to be figuring out as adults how we engage much more seriously in workplace-based change, but also how we engage in the kind of strike action for a different economy, which is not going to destroy the future, which has been sort of pioneered by the Youth Strikes for Climate.
Thanks, Rupert.
Give us an idea of what we should pursue.
Yeah, so the question is, thinking about academics generally, how should academics be taking forward this kind of agenda? And the example that was given was, how should academics be trying to bring deep adaptation into the conversation? So deep adaptation is obviously a challenging one. The simple answer, I would say, is that there needs to be some kind of space given for deep adaptation or collapsology on the curriculum, right? We need to reach a point where rather than always saying stuff like, if we don't do so-and-so and so-and-so, things are going to be really terrible, therefore we must do them, here's how we're going to do them, and endlessly kind of solutionizing and sort of going to the precipice just for a minute and then kind of quickly withdrawing. Instead, we've got to be willing to go to the precipice and look into the abyss, as Paul Kingsnorth puts it, and really look and see what that changes, and study the looking and study what you see at the bottom. I mean, the way I actually put it is that it's not really a question anymore of looking into the abyss, because that implies that we're on the edge of the cliff, but actually we're over the cliff. And you can think about it in the sort of metaphorical sense of we're like the cartoon characters that are off the cliff and like moving our feet so quickly in the air that we're managing to stay there for a little while, or slightly more literally, we're starting to fall down the cliff. We've got to try and stop ourselves from falling further down the cliff, and then start to try painfully to climb back up again. All of that needs to be studied. You know, all of that should be a central part of what academics are. Many academics, not all, but many academics are researching right now, or if not a central part, at least a part. Just a couple of hopeful remarks there. One is that you may have seen the recent article by Charlie Gardner et al. which is worth looking at, which tries to lay out an agenda for how universities can actually get serious about the climate and environment emergency. And the other is the news that actually, I'm not sure I can tell you this. All right, I better anonymize it. A very large grant has just been won by a couple of people, not me, but a couple of people who I know, on the topic of what universities should be doing differently and much more radically to address these kinds of questions. I think it will become public knowledge soon. So, maybe things are starting to shift.
Excellent, thank you. And I'd like, for any colleagues listening, I'd really like to keep that as an open thread that we take forward into the new academic year.
Yeah.
How at Falmouth we become a fulcrum of that here.
Yeah, great.
But we have a question from one of our town councillors,
Yep.
who says, what one thing should Falmouth Town Council be doing in the coming months? So let's...
Right. One thing. Okay. So what one thing should Falmouth Town Council be doing? Look, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I'm really in a position to advise. I'll say one thing, which is, I think, very important, which is there is a mismatch between the number of institutions that have declared a climate emergency and the number of institutions that have declared an ecological or nature emergency. There's been a huge, healthy, encouraging, exciting number, although remember the worries I did mention briefly half an hour or so ago about this, of institutions declaring a climate emergency, far less declaring a nature or ecological emergency. I think this is a problem. If we focus only on climate, we're really focusing much too narrowly on a symptom rather than on the disease. You and I were both saying, Matt, earlier, how the crisis that we're in is really a very broad one: democratic crisis, political crisis, a crisis of civilizational paradigm, etc. At minimum, we need to think that across the piece when it comes to its effect on the world at large. If we only focus on the climate, we're only focusing on a fragment of that. People sort of miss that because the climate is such a kind of huge thing. It's called a hyper-object by what's his name? Yes, Morton. And in some of my work, I called it a diffuse object. You can't touch it. It's kind of everywhere and nowhere. So people kind of think, the climate crisis is so overwhelming. How can you ask me to look at something even bigger? Right, but actually the climate is only one part of one aspect of the natural world, and people are sometimes now using the term climate as a sort of synonym for kind of green or ecological or something, and that's a kind of a dangerous development because there are massive overlaps, but there are also things which don't get included under the heading of climate. In terms of some of the overlaps, when you focus on the climate crisis and leave out the ecological dimension, you tend to miss, for example, the enormous importance of biological and ecological processes for the climate, which we're learning more and more about. For example, the huge significance of whales, literally huge significance of whales in terms of carbon sequestration. That's one of a myriad of examples. And then also you're going to get a lot of, you're already starting to get really bad stuff being put forward on the basis of a sort of narrow climate perspective. So people will argue that from a climate perspective, it's a good thing to do deep sea mining because you can then get the kinds of minerals and elements that we need for making electric car batteries, which will be on balance a good thing for the climate. But they miss then the terrible disruption to ocean ecosystems, which it looks like deep sea mining is causing, which, by the way, include also an enormous potential release of carbon from the base, so of the sea. So even on the carbon perspective, it may be quite misconceived. But anyway, I think you see the point that I'm making, that we really do need to think about the ecosphere in the round. And if I had one thing to say to Falmouth Town Council, that might be it. Don't focus on climate alone. Think about nature more broadly. Think about ecosystems. Maybe bring in a local ecologist to look at whatever it might be, the bats that you have, the biodiversity in the area. We need to be thinking in a more joined up and more holistic way, and not sort of fragmenting in the way that sometimes climate alone discourse does.
That's a great note to end on, and it also, I think, connects to a fundamentally empowering return to what happens in the local texture of our environment. There, you can go and tend specific pieces of land, whether you're defending an HS2 woodland or a woodland on the edge of the A30 in Cornwall. There are things we can do to promote the defence of biodiversity right here. It's also present tense, because what climate does is it tends to lean towards hypothetical future tense scenarios, whereas, I think if you ask the question, if 68% of wild mammalian biodiversity has gone in the last 50 years, what are you expecting to happen in the next 50 years? On what basis? And what do you think happens with a curve like that?
Yeah.
Where do you think it's going?
Absolutely.
But anyway, we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a great Q&A as well, I think, which has really opened up a lot of the material in the talk. So thanks for joining us.
No, thank you, everybody. Great discussion, yeah.